There is no desert, no road marked with tire-eaten dust, no roar that empties a man of his name. This is a park. This is now. When he opened his eyes, he noticed the source of the sound, a cluster of volunteers in neon vests bending over lumber by the old brick rec center that had been boarded up for as long as he'd been walking here. Someone had spray-painted House of Ice on the wall. The missing "all" implied by optimism or lack of paint. He would have smiled once at that. Now the corner of his mouth twitched and failed. He kept to his usual path, the loop that skirted the trees, and returned him home in exactly 40 minutes. Routine had become a fence he could lean on, but the wind shifted and carried sawdust and coffee across the grass, and he heard a voice, clear, bright, stubbornly hopeful, call out, "Hey, sir, do you have a minute?" He pretended he hadn't. The voice came closer. "Sir? Sorry. Hey, I'm Ryan. We're rebuilding the community house. For veterans and kids. We could use another pair of hands." Ethan turned too fast, his body still braced for that old life, and found a young man with a sunburned nose and paint on his sneakers. He was smiling. People smiled for all sorts of reasons in this new world. Sometimes it hurt to look at. "I'm not," Ethan started, the lie half-shaped. "I'm not whatever you think. I'm not useful. I'm not who I was." "It's okay if you don't know how to do this stuff," the kid said, lifting both palms. "We got folks who'll teach. Or if you know, well, that's great too. Coffee's free. Music's terrible. We're taking requests." Ethan glanced at the house. Up close, it looked worse. A brick rectangle with windows like missing teeth, a sagging roof, signs stapled on doors. No trespassing, no entry, like talismans against time. The volunteers had set up sawhorses. A woman laughed as she tried to measure a stubborn plank. A teenager in a black hoodie hammered with furious concentration and an alarming lack of rhythm. Ethan could see where the beam wanted to go. The measure was off by a hair. His hands moved in memory. Weight of wood, line of force, angle of nail. He swallowed. "Just a minute," Ryan asked. "No pressure." "5," Ethan heard himself say. 5 minutes." He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets as if to keep from reaching for a hammer. Ryan's smile widened like sunlight. "5 is perfect. Come on." The first thing Ethan touched was a broom. It felt like the right place to start, something humble and harmless. He pushed sawdust into neat piles and tried not to listen to the nail gun. But when it cracked again, he stopped and looked toward the sound on instinct. And in that instant, the teenager in the hoodie, small, maybe 16, caught his eye. The kid's face was set in a mask of effort, as if holding the entire project up with his jaw. "You're overdriving," Ethan said before he could decide to keep quiet. The boy blinked. "What?" "You're burying the nails," Ethan said. He crouched, palms careful on his knees. "You're making it too hard to pull up if you miss a line. Angle back 10 degrees. Half pressure. Let the tool be the tool." The kid glanced down, then at him. "Half pressure," he echoed, testing it, and the next nail slid in with a sound that felt like peace, clean and decisive. The boy's shoulders dropped. That was sick." "Less sick," Ethan said, "in a good way." "Luis," the kid said, almost daring him to forget. "Thanks." "Ethan," he said, the name feeling like something he could still carry without it breaking. 5 minutes turned into an hour, and the hour slid like a bead on a string. He tried to leave 3 times, and each time Ryan materialized with a small ask. Could he eyeball whether the beam sat true? Did he know why the sander kept choking? Could he show Luis how to mark studs without guessing? He found himself saying little things. "Do this, not that. Watch your fingers there." He found that where his voice touched the world sometimes changed, and always for the better. And the shock of that almost made him lightheaded. By late afternoon, someone had scrounged pizza. They ate, sitting on the curb with plates balanced on their knees, grease shining in the late light. Ryan folded his slice like a letter and kept talking about the grant they almost had and the fundraising they still needed and the dedication date they'd set, because if you didn't set a date, nothing ever became real. "We want it to be a place where people can show up without being okay," Ryan said. "We're calling it the anchor, like the thing that holds you when weather turns." Ethan stared at his hands. They were nicked by little cuts he hadn't felt happen. The scars across his knuckles were old, but the new marks stood next to them like small plants beside a tree. "Anchor," he repeated. The word felt weighty and correct. "You in for tomorrow?" Ryan asked. "Or am I being too pushy?" "You're pushy," Ethan said, and when Ryan started to apologize, he added, "It helps." That night, in the small apartment that sounded too loud when it was quiet, Ethan took the shoebox down from the top shelf. He laid the letters on the table, old, worn, edges softened by years of not reading them. He ran a finger along the top one, the ink smudged where someone had cried before it reached him. He didn't open it. He pressed his palm down on the stack like sealing a wound. Then he found a notebook and wrote 3 lines in an unsteady hand. "I helped build something today. It felt like breathing without thinking about it. I will go back." The next morning began with rain that smelled like iron, but by noon, the clouds had split. The worksite shook off the damp, and they started on framing the interior rooms. Ethan showed Luis how to snap a chalk line true, and the blue line fuzzed straight as a plum. "Half pressure," Luis said, now a joke that made him grin, "on the nail gun and life." Ethan almost told him that life sometimes needed full pressure, but then he remembered a line from somewhere. "Control what you can, accept what you cannot," and he held the thought instead of speaking it. He demonstrated how to seat a stud flush. He corrected his own tone when it slid toward bark. He watched the way the others watched him. Not for the old reasons, not for the way you watch a man who might drop in the heat of day, but with the simple interest of people learning, people trusting that someone knew a thing and would share it. A week in, the project acquired a rhythm. Ethan woke to the sun carving a white line on the blinds, made coffee in the chipped mug he'd stopped noticing was cracked, and walked to the park with his shoulders lifted by purpose. He learned names. The woman with the stubborn plank was Marlene, a nurse who worked nights and built by day because she said you sleep differently when you've lifted your arms for a reason. The man who never took off his baseball cap was Davion, who had 3 jokes for every situation and a laugh that sounded like an engine warming. A retired teacher named Alma could eyeball a level 2 rooms away and be right every time. Luis was there first every morning, hoodie up even in heat, eyes skating away from praise like it could burn him. It wasn't all clean. The nail gun still cracked like thunder, and sometimes Ethan had to put the hammer down and step outside until the edges of the world stopped blurring. Nobody commented on it, the way no one speaks in a chapel while someone prays. Ryan would usually appear 5 minutes later with a bottle of water and talk about nonsense until the ground steadied. What band made the best songs for sanding? Whether pineapple belonged on pizza? Ethan said no, with the dogmatic certainty of the saved. Which paint color said safe, without also saying waiting room? Ethan would breathe and remind himself of the line he'd started carrying in his pocket like a talisman. Decide only what is yours to decide. The rest is weather. The weather will do what it will. Bring your coat. On a Thursday that had started too well, a sky you could climb, a smell of sawdust sweet as bread, everything slipped. The city inspector came early and left them a list of violations that read like another language. The shipment of insulation never arrived. Luis's hammer snapped at the handle, a clean break, as if to prove some point about fragility, and he swore and threw the head hard enough to dent a pile of drywall. Ethan felt the old anger surge like a sudden flood. Control it, he thought. Choose. He put his hand on the drywall, palm flat. "Hey," he said to Luis, voice steady. "Breathe." "I'm breathing," Luis snapped, which usually meant he wasn't. I know you are, Ethan said. I just wanted to hear it, so I could breathe too. Louis stared at him. Then, because sometimes words are spells if you believe them hard enough, he inhaled and exhaled in exaggerated theatrical ostentation. It made Alma chuckle. The sound took the edge off. "What do we do about the inspector?" Ryan asked later, after he had finished cursing everything under his breath in a way that would have made his mother throw a shoe. "We make a list," Ethan said. "We do the part that's ours to do. You call about the insulation. I'll fix what we can fix. We ask for help on the rest. There's no glory in pretending to know things we don't." "Are you always this calm?" Ryan asked. "No," Ethan said. "I used to think if I could just get angry enough, I could burn a hole through whatever was in front of me. And now? Now I think holes just let in more weather." Ryan rubbed his jaw. "You talk like a book sometimes." "I talk like a man who is learning to talk," Ethan replied. That evening, the clouds that had been a line all day pulled together and a storm broke. The volunteers covered the tools as best they could, threw tarps over the exposed rooms, hammered stakes into mud that squelched under their boots. The rain thickened into a sheet, and when they finally let themselves run for their cars, soaked and laughing in that stunned way that follows a battle you can name, Ethan stood under the rec center's overhang and watched water slide off the brim of his cap in rivulets. He thought of another storm, under a different sky, where rain turned the ground into a trap, and the only shelter was the shadow of a vehicle that vibrated with heat. And he felt the two images reach for each other like hands. He took them both in. He whispered, not sure if he was talking to the God he sometimes believed in or the friends he sometimes talked to anyway. "Thank you for this rain that only wets us. Thank you that no one is lost tonight." He found the small church a few blocks from home by accident, or by the sort of accident that comes from walking with your eyes open when your mind is full. The doors were unlocked, and inside it smelled like wood polish and old paper. A woman mopped the tile near the back and nodded at him in that way church people do, as if to say, whether you believe or not, you're always allowed to come in from the weather. He sat in a back pew and watched the sanctuary darken at the edges as the rain pressed its hands to the stained glass. A prayer his mother used to say came to him, not as a litany, but as a request. "Grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, wisdom to know the difference." He said it under his breath and felt foolish, and then felt less foolish because it helped. The next day, the storm had peeled paint and soaked tools, but the tarps held. They worked with a kind of chastened focus, and when the insulation finally arrived, everyone cheered like it was the returning hero in a story. Between tasks, Ryan leaned against a beam and said, "My dad served. I mentioned that, right?" "You said he was a veteran," Ethan replied. "He drank like he was trying to outrun something. Died when I was 19. I used to think if I built enough, I could, I don't know, build the part of him that broke." Ryan gave an embarrassed laugh. "That sounds ridiculous out loud." "It doesn't," Ethan said. He tried to picture the boy Ryan had been, hands too small for a coffin. He thought of the men he had carried even when the carrying had been in memory alone. You can't build the past, but you can build the place you wish it had happened in. Ryan's breath hitched. He blinked hard and nodded like agreeing could hold him together. "That's the idea." As they moved into finishing the common room, the project became a different kind of battle. Choices multiplied, paint colors argued. The line between good enough and excellent grew thin. Ethan found himself surprisingly stubborn about little things, the kind of stubbornness you only spend when you care. He argued for the table's edges to be rounded, not because squared corners looked sharper, but because rounded ones meant fewer bruises for kids who would run here when the weather turned, whatever that weather meant, outside or inside them. He lobbied for a small shelf near the door where people could leave a note. I was here. I needed help. Or I left cookies. Or I drew a picture of a cat that looks like a potato. He didn't say it like a mission statement. He said it like someone nailing a board. As the dedication date edged closer, Ethan's nights grew crowded. Memories he had kept in the shoebox pushed their way out and sat with him at the table. He didn't argue. He made them tea. He let the voices of the lost say whatever they needed to say, and when their words made his ribs ache, he pressed a hand there and stayed. On the anniversary of the worst day, the one that had hooked into his back and pulled every day after it with a drag, he didn't go to the site. He walked to the lake before dawn and sat on a bench and watched the sky move from black to bruised to pale pearl. He said each name he'd been carrying, not to summon, not to release, but to acknowledge, like touching photographs. A runner came by with a dog that looked like it had been carved from happiness. The dog leaned on his knee with the casual intimacy of creatures who do not understand what a gift that is. Ethan put his hand on its head and felt something unknit just a little. When he returned to the site the following day, Luis handed him a folded piece of paper without eye contact. "For when your head gets loud," the boy muttered. Inside was a scribbled playlist of songs, some titles crossed out and re-added, all carefully numbered. At the bottom, in smaller print, it said, "It gets loud for me too. Half pressure." Ethan slid the note into his pocket like a talisman. "Thanks," he said, and because gratitude had grown a new muscle in him, he added, "I'm glad you're here." Luis grunted, "Which was teenager for you just changed my life." The last week was a sprint. They painted in shifts, taped trim, cleaned until the floors reflected faces. They installed a long table in the common room and hung a bulletin board above the shelf by the door. Alma brought in a potted plant and threatened anyone who tried to give it a cutesy name. Davian snuck in a speaker system that looked found and sounded expensive. Marlene organized a schedule of 3 months' worth of meals cooked by people who had all written thank yous on the sign-up sheet, though no one could say for what exactly. Ryan grew quieter, which was how he carried hope, close to the chest like an ember. 2 days before the dedication, a beam slipped from a sawhorse. It fell with the kind of deliberate heavy that makes you aware of how bones break. Luis was in its path. There was no time for speech. There was only the body's decision. Ethan moved. He caught the end of the beam with his forearms and bore down, knees giving. Pain sang bright as metal along his wrists. He didn't drop. Others rushed in. The beam settled safely. The silence afterward was a held breath around a wound that did not happen. "You okay?" Ryan asked, voice too calm. Ethan flexed his fingers. They answered. "Fine," he lied. And then, because the new life asked for better, he amended, "Not fine, but okay." Luis stood frozen, the mask of effort drained off, leaving a too young face. "I didn't see it," he whispered, horror sliding in. "I wasn't watching." "You're watching now," Ethan said. He put a gentler hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's what counts. You pay attention to this moment, you learn, you move on, you don't carry what didn't happen. But if is weather," Ethan said. "You bring your coat, you keep going." That night, his wrists throbbing like a second heartbeat, Ethan returned to the church. He sat in the same pew and folded his hands, not because it made him holier, but because it made him still. He whispered thanks, not poetic, just pointed. For beams held, for hands that had grabbed and lifted, for a boy's life continuing into 100 possible futures. He felt foolish again and then thought, folly in gratitude is better than pride in despair. He left a small note on the back table where people left requests. It did not say, "Fix me." It said, "Teach me to use the strength I have in the service of more than my fear." The day of the dedication arrived mild as mercy. People drifted across the park in twos and threes, drawn by the music and the promise of lemonade and the knowledge that something new had occurred in the place where nothing had changed for too long. The sign above the door read, "The Anchor." In letters someone with a steady hand had painted. The shelf by the door already held notes. "I'm proud of you. You're not alone. Someone who used to drink here now makes muffins here." There were photos on one wall. Smiling faces, scraped knees, sun flare caught in hair. Ethan stood near the back and thought of turning, of walking away before anyone could ask him to speak, before someone could name him and the naming make his skin too tight. Then Ryan found him and said, "I want to say something, and I want you with me when I do." Ethan shook his head. "I don't..." Ryan put a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to talk. Just stand with me." So my knees stopped doing whatever they're doing. They stood at the front with paint still ghosting their nails. Ryan spoke about the grant they'd finally secured, about the donations that had appeared with notes that said, "Because someone built a table for me once," about the meals scheduled and the classes planned, and the quiet corners intentionally left for people who needed to sit without speaking. He spoke about his father without pretending that love had made the ending less jagged. Then he swallowed and said, "I thought we were building a place for people to come when they were broken, but I think we built a place where people can remember they were never broken beyond repair. I think we built a place where strong means something different. I didn't do this alone. This is a house that many hands raised. One of those hands caught a beam this week. I'd like to ask the person who attached that strength to purpose to stand with me. Ethan?" The room turned as one. For a breath, all of Ethan's rehearsed refusals lined up. He could recite them by heart. He didn't. He walked forward because you say yes to the life that keeps saying yes to you. He stood next to Ryan and looked out at the crowd and did the bravest thing he would do that day. He let himself be seen. He didn't speak for long. He said that building a wall straight gives you a chance to build a life straighter. He said that sometimes the loudest thing in the room was in your head, and that if you met it with attention instead of anger, it quieted, like a kid who only wanted to be heard. He said that when the storm came, they had covered what they could, and the rest had been grace. He didn't say the names he carried. They were there anyway, standing with him in the way the living and the dead stand together when something good finally happens. He ended with the sentence he had written on the first day in his notebook, and he felt it transform as it left his mouth. "I helped build something today. It helped build me back." After the applause, after the lemonade, after the kids had run their fingers along the rounded edges of the table and declared it weird but cool, as if that was the most holy commendation, Ethan found a quiet corner. Luis appeared, shifting from foot to foot like he had bolts where other people had ankles. "You did okay," Luis said, which was teenager, for I have never been prouder of an adult. "You too," Ethan said. He nodded toward the shelf. "Leave a note?" Luis scowled, as if such sentiment might be contagious. But later, when the crowd had thinned, Ethan walked by and saw a square of paper tucked between others. It said, in blocky capitals, "I was going to break. I didn't. See you tomorrow." When the sun bent down and the evening pulled its first cool threads through the warm air, Ethan stayed to stack chairs. Ryan handed him a trash bag and then, because gratitude makes talkers of us all, said, "When I asked you on that first day, I didn't know if you'd even hear me." "I heard you," Ethan said. "It just took a minute for the part of me that answers to show up." "Do you think you'll keep coming back?" Ryan asked, not like a plea, but like a plan. "I think," Ethan said slowly, testing the words the way he'd test a plank before he trusted it with weight, "that some doors, once opened, don't close in the same way." He looked around the room, the table, the plant Alma had finally allowed to be named Brick, the scuffed floor that was already a map of use. He thought of the church and the rain and the dog that leaned on him like faith you can pet. He thought of the way his fears had not left, but learned to sit without gnawing through the leash. He thought of the way his hands knew the weight of a beam, and the way his chest now knew the weight of something else, something lighter. "Yes," he said, "I'll keep coming back." That night, he put the shoebox on the table and opened the top letter. He read slowly, letting the words settle where they would. When he was done, he took out his notebook and wrote beneath the first page where he had written about breathing without thinking. "Today, we opened the anchor. People came in from the weather. I felt the old storm like thunder under my ribs, but it did not tear anything down. I said thank you and meant it. I built a shelf for other people's words and found a place for my own." On Sunday, he sat in the back pew again. The light through the stained glass painted his hands in colors that belonged to stories older than his. He didn't say much this time. He listened. The world hummed softly around him, air conditioning, someone coughing, a page turned far away, and beneath that, a quieter sound he only now recognized as the part of him that endures. He left a note on the table because he liked the practice of it. It said, "I will try to remember that strength is gentle when it can be and steady when it must. Help me to do the next right thing and leave the rest to weather." Weeks stretched gently forward, the anchor filled with small lives. A woman came every Tuesday to sit by the window and knit with the meticulous intensity of someone keeping something from unraveling. 2 boys built a lopsided birdhouse and proudly hung it where any self-respecting bird would decline to live. A robin moved in anyway. A formerly loud man learned to speak softly and discovered people listened harder. Louise brought a little sister who drew cats that looked increasingly like potatoes with legs, and she pinned everyone to the board with a solemnity that made everyone stand a little straighter. Ethan learned the strange and holy economy of showing up, how the currency of presence paid debts you didn't know you owed. He still flinched sometimes when a nail gun cracked. He still woke at 3 in the morning and followed a thought down a rabbit hole that had no bottom. On those nights, he would get up and make tea and write a letter to someone who would never read it. He would place it in the shoebox and then place his hand on the lid and say, "Quiet now." He would sometimes whisper the prayer, not seeking an answer so much as aligning his breath with something kinder than fear. In the morning, he would go to the anchor and wrap his fingers around a hammer and remember that the weight he chose changed the story of the day. One evening, months after the opening, Ethan found himself alone in the common room, sunlight flattening into gold against the long table. He ran his palm along the smoothed, rounded edge. It had been right to fight for this softness. He thought of the first day and the 5 minutes he had tried to keep the world to. He smiled, and the smile stayed. He had taken the smallest possible step and found it led somewhere he could stay. He didn't know what came next in any grand sense. He knew there would be storms and misplaced nails, and days when the plant named Brick looked like it had decided to quit. He knew that in those moments, he had a coat, and he had a room, and he had hands that had learned the difference between holding and clenching. He turned off the lights and stood in the doorway, looking back at the shadowed room that would make morning again. He slipped a note onto the shelf, between a child's drawing and a scrawled apology. It said simply, "I'm still here." And then he stepped out into the evening, where the air smelled faintly of sawdust and bread, and the world, which had once been only weather, felt like a place that could hold him.